West African countries have a rich tapestry of vibrant cultures, languages, and histories. But lurking beneath this diverse surface lays a story of frustration and, yes, the growing thirst for liberation from what's often dubbed neo-colonialism. You see, French colonialism ended in the 1960s, but even after the curtain fell on direct colonial rule, the echoes of French influence continued to resonate. Now, we can't ignore the connections between the historical past and the present. You've heard about those eyebrow-raising coups and power struggles in Niger and West Africa, right? Well, let's take a moment to take a glance at the historical context of French colonial legacies and ongoing neo-colonialism to understand what's unfolding today. So, without further ado, let's dive in. French colonialism in Africa. The late 19th century was a time when European powers were eyeing Africa, and among them, France staked its claim by colonizing vast territories from Algeria to Senegal and beyond. However, just like their colonial counterparts, the French, armed with baguettes and bayonets, were after resources like rubber, minerals, and, of course, the notorious cash crops. For instance, throughout the French colonies, local African communities worked tirelessly on plantations and in mines, their sweat and toil fueling the European industrial machine. All the while, these riches flowed back to France, leaving African economies stripped bare. However, on the contrary, while both British and French powers were out for resources, the French had a knack for direct rule, often imposing their culture and language. While the British, on the other hand, took a more indirect approach, letting local leaders maintain some authority. Therefore, fast forward to today, and France still controls its former colonies through economic, political, social, and military means. Economic control. Our tale begins in the dark days of monoculture agriculture, when French colonies in Africa were forced into a life full of sweat and tears. For example, African laborers worked in vast plantations and fields under brutal conditions, all for the riches that sailed back to French shores. But guess what? Even after the spotlight faded on direct colonial rule, a new economic stage was set. Notably, France introduced the CFA franc across its former colonies, and the currency continues to cast a shadow over these nations. Although the currency was born of France's desire to foster unity among its colonies, it came with strings attached. Furthermore, while the CFA franc is pegged to the euro, it's the French treasury that guarantees its value. As a result, France maintains a tight grip on the economic stability of its former colonies, and these former colonies often find themselves trapped in a cycle where economic crises are solved with loans from their former ruler. Moreover, what's even more mind-boggling is the fact that the puppeteering doesn't stop there. Many of these countries have their monetary policy frameworks set up in France. Also, their banknotes are made in France, and it's as if the colonial currency never really shook off its old ties, leaving the printing presses on French soil. Overall, France is so keen on this financial dance with its former colonies as a result of its intertwining of economics, power, and history, and thus wields a kind of invisible leverage over these nations, shaping policies from behind the scenes. Political influence. Unlike other colonial masters, France isn't just a bystander, it's got its fingerprints all over the domestic affairs of its former colonies, and French policies and interests shape the very course of their politics, often behind the scenes. For instance, at the institutional level, there are various intergovernmental organizations working under the banner of the Agence de Coopération Culturelle et Technique, which tries to weave cultural and educational bonds between France and its francophone partners. But that's not all. France isn't just playing politics, it's investing in the future, with a significant chunk of development funds going towards education, scholarships, and cultural institutes. For example, France promotes the French language as not just a tool of communication but also a conduit for values, culture, and a sense of identity. That's why France goes to great lengths to promote it, pouring resources into keeping the linguistic flame burning bright. But wait, while all of this may sound well-intentioned, it's also about maintaining a foothold. Notably, France even has a dedicated Ministère de la Francophonie, set up to further reinforce these cultural and linguistic ties. Overall, France goes through all this effort to nurture connections that run deep, rooted in the Latin world's values and culture, setting itself apart from the Anglo-Saxon world. Military influence. France maintains a network of military bases, like strategic outposts, scattered across the African landscape, including in Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Chad, Djibouti, and more. Notably, it's a tale that starts during the Cold War when defending Africa from the clutches of communism became a strategic tool, as these bases weren't just fortresses, they were key players in maintaining regional dominance and protecting French interests. But hold on, because France wasn't shy about certain withdrawals. In 2010, they handed the sovereignty of a base over to Senegal, a gesture that seemed like a shift. However, they still held the strings to their military puppetry. Fast forward to more recent history, think Ivory Coast and the overthrow of Laurent Gbagbo. French forces, long in the theater, swooped in with UN endorsement to overthrow a democratically elected president. Therefore, France clings to these military footholds to continue to maintain their influence, since these bases are more than barracks, they're tools of diplomacy and whispers of power that echo across borders. However, the winds of change are blowing as the African Union, flexing its muscles with initiatives like the Peace and Security Council and the African Standby Force, aims to let African nations take the reins in their own affairs. So, while France's military stronghold still stands, cracks are forming in the walls as the public, both French and African, raises their eyebrows, questioning the motives behind these deployments. Cultural and language impact. France, with its rich history, found itself in a dance with its former colonies as their cultures and identities intertwined. While the British colonial era often embraced indigenous tongues, France took a different route. Notably, the French language wasn't just a means of communication, it was a tool of connection, unity, and even of influence, and it continues the trend through l'Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, OIF, a stage where the French language takes the spotlight. Furthermore, while the French language becomes a bridge, it also becomes a portal to French ideals, values, and ways of life. For example, across the former colonies, French-inspired curricula shaped the minds of the next generation. Also, media acts as the megaphone of cultural exchange, with French films, music, and literature that flow across borders. Overall, France still uses these cultural and language connections to retain some influence over its former African colonies. Voices of change. African leaders and activists are rewriting the narrative, challenging the grip of French influence, and striving for a future where the reins of power rest in African hands. From the classroom to the streets, movements for greater autonomy gain momentum. African nations, rich in resources, envision a future where economic prosperity is no longer tied to the strings of external powers. Progress has been made, and France's grip is slowly loosening, although the country is still relenting on its strategic interests and economic ties due to its desire to maintain a presence on the world stage. Future outlook. If France's influence continues unchecked, it could cast shadows over this promising future through stagnation, dependence, and a perpetuation of the cycle that it has held in its grip on these nations for decades. For instance, the continued influence may result in former French colonies in Africa taking drastic measures, such as carrying out coups on presidents who are pro-France. Now, let's talk about the recent coups that rocked Niger, Burkina Faso, and Guinea-Conakry. Are they a result of French influence? While it's a complex web of factors, the lingering threads of history and external interests from its colonial master can't be denied. Conclusion. And there you have it. We've embarked on a journey through the topic of why and how France still holds its former African colonies. From the echoes of history to the whispers of influence, we've unraveled layers upon layers of this intricate tale. We've explored the economic ties that bind, the cultural and linguistic embrace, the military presence that lingers, and the voices of change that yearn for autonomy. As we wrap up this journey, I want to express my gratitude to each and every one of you for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button, share, and subscribe button to stay tuned. See you on the next adventure.